Thank you very much for the invitation. I will talk in English. I prepared my talk in English, also thinking that it was more accessible to people here, but I'm aware that almost anybody, or even all of you, can also understand German, but okay, it's now in English. The first remark before I start with the topic, the second remark, I consider myself as an insider-outsider, Western philosophy and non-Western philosophy in between, because I spent almost 20 years in the Andes of Latin America among indigenous people, so I have both perspectives. And the third remark is I will not deal with nihilism in the explicitive sense, but I think my main thesis is that dominant Western thinking has had and even has today some kind of nihilistic effect upon non-Western societies and indigenous philosophies. That's my point. And I will, I try to develop it in mainly 3 steps. So as you see, there are a lot of difficult terms here and concepts here, and I wonder if it would have been very easy to translate it in Slovenian, because it's not so easy, all these. Perhaps at the end of my talk you will understand a little bit, but of course there will always rest some kind of strangeness, and that's my point. My point has to do with interculturality and with intercultural strangeness as a creative force to get in contact with the otherness, with the alterity. So the first point, just to resume, has to do with intercultural philosophy. A little bit, perhaps you know all about it, so it's perhaps nothing new, but it has to do with my topic. And the second point has to do with epistemic violence as some main concept of decolonial and post-colonial studies and philosophy. And then the third aspect, this epistemic violence leads to Philosophicide in the case of Andean philosophy. So I will talk about this special case of Andean philosophy, just to introduce, of course, because it's a huge thing. And I will end with some remarks on how, perhaps, what are the consequences of all this. In his 1961 work, Totalité et Infinie, Emmanuel Levinas warns in the introduction that it is of utmost importance to be very careful not to become the useful fool of morality. What the philosopher of human ethics par excellence says about morality, intercultural philosophy can say about culture. That you should not be the useful fool of intercultural discourse, proposing and doing philosophy in an intercultural way. After more than 30 years of efforts, intercultural philosophy is facing kidnapping, not only by the postmodern culturalist philosophy, but also by neoliberal capitalism itself, which has discovered interculturality as a means of universal knowledge to be exploited and appropriated. What happened despite Levinas' warning with the ethical, and what is happening today with ecology and sustainability, is also about to happen with the intercultural. The media and digital mega machine of capitalist neoliberalism seeks to absorb the initially critical concept of interculturality for the purposes of marketing and globalization of the Western model of knowledge and power. The intercultural narrative, in a postmodern sense, has become fashionable. I come to the first point about intercultural philosophy. Of course, I will skip different points, not to be too long. Intercultural philosophy emerged in Latin America as a continuation and creative renewal of liberation philosophy, considering the hermeneutic turn in the wake of the 5th centenary of the Congress in 1992. In other parts of the world, intercultural philosophy has had other antecedents, for instance in India, subaltern studies, in Europe, comparative philosophy, and in the US, postmodern theories. Although different strands of intercultural thinking have intersected over the last 30 years, two main paradigms of intercultural thinking can be discerned. On the one hand, this kind of intercultural thinking is based on the idea of diversity and strongly raises the issue of identity. And is an exercise of comparison between different philosophical traditions. On the other side, you have the other current, which is based on a real asymmetry between cultures as an expression of inequalities and injustices at the global level. Due to the global constellation of economic, political, and symbolic power relations, the first paradigm is becoming increasingly dominant in the fields of aesthetics, politics, and the sciences of symbolic representation. The result is often absorption of the critical and liberating potential by the global monoculture itself. In order for intercultural philosophy not to become the useful fool, as Levinas said, of multiculturalism or of a postmodern aesthetic of anything goes, it is essential to recover the critical and anti-systemic potential of the theme of interculturality. And this implies betting on the second paradigm of intercultural philosophy that has been cultivated above all, but not only, in Latin America, that is to say, an interculturality in a liberating and critical perspective. With this option, intercultural philosophy clearly distances itself from a postmodernity light and bets more on a transmodernity and the possibility of maintaining and deepening the discourse of justice and inclusion despite being part of a meta-narrative that has been delegitimized by a large part of the academy. This current of a more critical and liberating narrative of interculturality is itself broadening and deepening in two senses. First, it must include the decolonial discourse as a transcendental analytical moment for the 21st century, on the one hand, and second, it has to establish true and symmetrical dialogues with indigenous philosophies and knowledge. These two challenges. However, care must be taken not to embrace decolonial and post-colonial theories without qualms, as if they hold the key to critical interculturality. On the question of the critique of colonial and neo-colonial structures and moments, we can also see two quite distinct strands. The watershed is practically the same as in the case of interculturality. There is, on the one hand, the Anglo-Saxon European tradition that speaks of post-colonial studies, and there is the Latin American tradition that speaks more in terms of decolonial theories. Decoloniality and the decolonial. Post-colonial studies emerged in contexts of recent formal political decolonization, such as in India, and are based on subaltern studies, Gayatri Spivak. The post-colonial thinker avant la lettre is the Palestinian Edward Said, with his 1978 work Orientalism, which opens the debate on Eurocentrism and the perspective of the other by a dominant Western civilization. Through Indian thinkers, post-colonial studies spread to the United States and Europe, Stuart Hall, and had a strong impact on literary criticism, sociology, and anthropology. Post-colonial studies do not refer only to the phase of political decolonization, although the term post-colonial was initially used in this sense, but must be placed in the context of postmodernism and post-structuralism. In a sense, the post-colonial approach, like the feminist or intercultural approach, is a transversal approach that includes all spheres of human life and all cultural contexts. For the Anglo-American tradition, the binary pair of the opposites, West and the rest, that's the title of the book of Stuart Hill, and thus the critique of Eurocentrism are at the foreground. On the other hand, decolonial studies, estudios decoloniales, can be traced back to the 1961 work The Damned of the Earth, Les Damnés de la Terre, of Frantz Fanon, a native of the Caribbean island of Martinique, who raises the persistent oppression of the formerly colonized population through new forms of colonialism. In 1992, the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano published a landmark text on the subject of coloniality and modernity/rationality, in which he sees the continuation of the colonization of the whole planet by the West in the universalization of typical Western rationality and thus of its forms of knowledge and knowledge production, coining the expression coloniality of power. For the coloniality of knowledge, which means, that's a term which is introduced by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, for the coloniality of knowledge, that means that non-Western forms of knowledge, their philosophies, spiritualities, theologies, and contexts of meaning are disrespectfully denoted to religious consciousness, mythological attempts at explanation, or folk wisdom. And Western episteme is hypostasized as the only source of meaning. That means coloniality of knowledge, no? I come after to the concept of epistemic violence, which has to do with it, of course. Important for the decolonial approach are cultural and civilizational asymmetries, the question of power, and the connection to concrete liberation. Decolonial studies aim to go beyond a light interculturalism and mere multiculturalism, questioning the symbolic order as a manifestation of power relations. And philosophy is not beyond these kind of power relations. While these power relations were quite manifest and could be identified with colonial power in colonial times, in post-colonial and neo-colonial times, the analysis of power and coloniality is much more difficult. While in other contexts, such as India, the analysis underlines subalternity and persistent colonial structure in present-day domination of certain epistemologies, the internalization of colonial values and symbolic and mental whitening as elements of contemporary colonization. That's main points of decolonial studies. Formerly, Latin America has been living in post-colonial domination since 200 years, politically independent. But even so, the continent drags along many elements of colonial domination in its legal, educational, political, and religious system. What is more, colonialism has been intensifying in recent decades as a form of voluntarily assumed alienation. There is a Bolivian sociologist who labeled that we make us responsible for our own alienation. There are bad tongues that say that Miami is the clandestine capital of Peru. Critical intercultural philosophy attempts to articulate the tradition of liberation philosophy, intercultural dialogue, or polylogue, and decolonial studies in such a way as to recover the critical and anti-systemic potential of intercultural thought against its kidnapping by the postmodern neoliberal mainstream. I come now to the second point about epistemic violence of the West. In order to address the hegemonic stance of Western philosophy in relation to subaltern, or better, subalternized philosophies, such as the indigenous ones of Abya-Yala. Could be that you don't know the term Abya-Yala is the indigenous term for Latin America. Abya-Yala. I want to elaborate on a specific concept developed by decolonial studies, namely the concept of epistemic violence and the corresponding concept of epistemicide. Both refer to the type of coloniality commonly known under the title of coloniality of knowledge, which has to do, in contrast to the coloniality of power and coloniality of being, with the production, dissemination, application, and valuation of knowledge. Epistemic violence is a concept coined by the Indian literary critic and feminist Gayatri Spivak in her 1988 article, Can the Subaltern Speak? Taken from Pierre Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence and adapted to the situation of subaltern groups, including women. According to Spivak, epistemic violence consists in the colonial process of subalternizing colonized knowledge as subjugated knowledge. A total body of knowledge that has been disqualified as inadequate to its task or insufficiently elaborated, naive knowledge, located at the bottom of the hierarchy, below the required level of cognition or scientificity. In the Anglo-Saxon world, the concept of epistemic violence has had greater repercussions in the Black and Afro community. One of the most prominent representatives is the Afro-American feminist philosopher Christy Dodson. In the Latin American context, the Colombian philosopher Santiago Castro Gomez has explored the concept further, while the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos has been one of the pioneers in raising the decolonial question of epistemology in general and the coloniality of knowledge in particular, as an important tool for undertaking how colonialism continues to function beyond the colony. Epistemic violence would be, according to this concept, the perpetuation of colonialism by other, more subtle and sophisticated means than its classic form of the colonial era between the 15th and 20th century. According to Boaventura de Sousa Santos, there are 5 modes of epistemological discrimination that result in the production of absences, and here I think enters the theme of nihilism, in the production of absences or non-existence of the other. It has to do with alterity, with the otherness. First, the ignorant. Second, the backward. Third, the inferior. Fourth, the local particular. And fifth, the unproductive or sterile. These are prejudices from a dominant epistemic system towards subjugated or subalternized epistemic system. The colonial or neo-colonial is extended through the negation. And here we have the term negation in the sense for nihilization of the colonized person or nation to be an epistemic and productive subject. It's a no subject, a no person, and to be secured itself as literal, advanced, superior, universal, and productive. That's the point, no? To negate the authority, but to hypostaze the sameness, as Levinas would say. In colonial times, epistemic violence served as an ideological justification for the superiority of Western European science and technology, and on the philosophical level, for the exclusivity of the philosophical character of the colonizer's thought. Through the mechanism of othering, the conquered and colonized indigenous populations, these were labeled barbaric, illiterate, heathen, and ignorant, depending on the aspect to be emphasized. And through processes of negation, compartmentalization, parallelism, and adaptation, the aim was to maintain the supremacy of, or even exclusivity of the dominant European knowledge. This process entailed a veritable epistemicide, an extermination, an extirpation of millennia-old indigenous knowledge, and the almost total loss of indigenous traditional knowledge. It leads essentially to the destruction of knowledge, sciences, and cultures that did not know or did not want to assimilate to the white Western culture. And part of these are indigenous philosophies. Whereas in the colonial era, epistemicide was carried out brutally and manu militari, in the post-colonial era, which is at the same time neo-colonial, epistemicidal tendencies manifest themselves much more subtly and under the cloak of progressivity and development. That's why the title, Progress as Barbarism. Western technoscience has been and remains for more than 500 years the primary actor of epistemic violence, imposing the standards of the academia on the whole world and exporting the European and US-American model of development and progress to other countries. Universities and the mass media are currently the main driver of the universalization of the scientific ideal and the single Western epistemology. This means for other knowledges and epistemologies that any knowledge, science, and technology that does not conform to the standards of Western technoscience is considered folklore, cosmovision, parascience, or simply mythology. In the case of philosophy, any attempt to elaborate non-Western indigenous philosophies is dismissed as romanticism and backwardness, or at best, as mythology. The epistemic violence of the West manifests itself in the dynamics of elevating certain dogmas or axioms of modern Western philosophy to a supracultural, universal, or even absolute status. When I talk about Western philosophy, I talk about modern Western, dominant modern Western philosophy. Not all, of course. So you have to be a little bit differentiated, but the dominant Western philosophy which has led to what you were talking about, no? Climate change, etc. And of course we can discuss if Nietzsche, for instance, is part of it or not. Of this dominant Western modern philosophy. So I will talk about just really as some kind of Idealtypen in the Weberian sense, 5 axioms or dogmas of dominant modern Western philosophy. The first one has to do with time, concept of time. The conviction that time is oriented linearly from the beginning to an end, in a continuous and ascending manner, progressivity, progress. This conviction of Semitic origin forms the ideological basis for the Western optimism that everything is oriented towards a omega point, be it the classless society, the perfect market, or paradise on earth. The road to such a point is called development or growth, depending on the approach. Today, to think of an economy without growth or a society without development is blasphemous and considered nonsense or even a logical contradiction. That's the first axiom. Of course, it's not in any of the philosophies of the West, of course not, but dominant, and which has impacted a lot of fields outside philosophy. Second, the diuresis of epistemological dualism between subject and object. This Subjekt-Objekt-Spaltung in German. A human subject is viewed vis-à-vis an object in such a way that the former possesses all the characteristics of an autonomous, rational, spiritual, and active entity, while the object in the tendency is considered inert, dependent, irrational, and passive. The metaphysical foundation is Descartes' ontological dualism between a thinking spiritual substance, res cogitans, and an extensive material one, res extensa, which has repercussions on the modern Western conception of nature as an exploitable and appropriable object. And the day before yesterday, I mentioned it as a commentary. The think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, becomes I conquer, therefore I am. Conquiro ergo sum. The third axiom or dogma of dominant modern Western philosophy is an elitist anthropology that is defined by what differentiated the human being from all the rest. It's called speciesism or human centrism. In reality, this human being is the white adult Western male owner. No? And women, children, indigenous people, Afro-descendants, as well as non-human nature becomes the object of his predatory enterprise. Therefore, and this is the axiom, it is a conflictive and competitive anthropology, which is imposed against nature, but secondly also against women, and in general against the non-Western world. Fourth axiom, it's a strong anthropocentrism that dominates Western modernity. The human being in the figure of the white heterosexual male adult owner is the measure of all things that must be adapted to the stated ideal. Nature serves the human being as a reservoir. We speak about natural resources. Nobody, the Anders would, among indigenous people, would think about to talk about resources. Incredible. And the field for the realization of the predatory anthropological project. If the other cannot be anthropomorphized, any kind of natural nexus is cut off. Well, the second axiom or dogma has to do with the predominance. This is more, has to do with epistemology, has to do with the predominance of analysis as a tool for knowing and mastering the world. analysis, literally decomposition, is based on the conviction that an object can be comprehensively known by breaking it down into its parts, investigating and describing each of them, the method of Descartes, and putting them together to arrive at full knowledge. And Western technoscience is broadly based on this axiom, which has produced astonishing results in the technological, pharmaceutical, and military conquest of the planet. But I think it's typically masculine, male. It's a male epistemology. In the generic and not biological sense, it's a violent approach because when you do it with an organism, you know what's the end. It's the death of the organism who you want to know. Resuming these axioms, dominant Western philosophy was imposing and is still imposing today these axioms on the rest of the planet as universal truths and distorting, disqualifying, or even destroying all kinds of axioms or principles that contradict them. Of course, there are also heterodox meanings within Western tradition, and it would be very important to make them visible. But I come now to the third part of my talk, Epistemicide as Philosophicide, the case of Andean philosophy. In the case of Abhyayala's indigenous knowledge and wisdom, the epistemicide committed during the colonial period has been perpetuated to the present day. Denial, exclusion, marginalization, and even above all, ignorance have driven ancestral cosmospirituality. Just a remark, I do not speak about cosmovision. That's the anthropological term that is used by ethnologists, cosmovision, because vision is a typically dominant Western concept. Andean culture is not visual in the first sense. So ignorance towards ancestral cosmospirituality, religiosity, culture, and philosophy. And what remained of it was branded by the representatives of Western knowledge as myth, backwardness, heresy, barbarism. Regarding philosophy, the Western definition itself eliminates from the very beginning and the outset of the definition any possibility of there being philosophy in Abhyayala. Because the very definition of philosophy as it is dominant in Western tradition means it is written philosophy, texts. It has individual authors with name and surname. It has a binary method of distinguishing, the Aristotelic logic, and it is institutionalized in study houses called universities and academia. And all these points I was mentioned are not present in Andean philosophy. So, ergo, there is no Andean philosophy. But you see, the point, of course, the definition of philosophy is monocultural, is Eurocentric. And you have to overcome, of course, this kind of epistemic violence. First, a philosophical otherness renders philosophical sameness. In the case, hegemonic Western philosophy is itself relative and perspective and contextual. For instance, coming back to these 5 axioms I was mentioning of the dominant Western philosophy of modernity, the first one concerning the conception of time, Andean conception of time is cyclical, it's not linear, but it's neither circular, as the Greek thought. It's cyclical, that means the future is behind, the past is in front. And we are walking backwards to the future, but looking at the past. That is like that, looking to the past, walking to the future. And also in Quechua and Aymara languages, you can see that. No? For instance, Kepa Pacha means future, but Kepa is back. And Pacha is a term, I talk about Pacha Sophia or Pacha Sophie instead of philosophy. Pacha is a word as in Western philosophy perhaps being. But it's not all the same. Pacha is also time and space and universe and cosmos and life. Yeah. You all know Pachamama perhaps, but of course Pachamama is also a term which cannot be translated easily into Western concepts. The second one is that time is not unidirectional now. Coming from the past, passing through the present, going to a future, no? From alpha to omega. No, it's disruptional and cyclical. And you have ruptures called Pachacuti. And concerning climate change and global warming, a lot of wise men and women in the Andes say there was a Pachacuti, so a cosmical rupture, you could say, when the conquest was starting, so 500 years ago. And they say every 500 years there is a Pachacuti. So we are now at the moment of a new Pachacuti. Well, how many time I have? How much?
We started a bit later, so I think you have
10 minutes, okay. Yeah. That has to do with progress, of course, with the concept of development, of growth, of etc. What to the West is progress and growth, for the Andes can be regression and a threat to the cosmic balance. It is, I already mentioned, it is inconceivable for Andean cosmos spirituality that there could be unlimited growth. And that this supposed growth could serve as a criterion for the quality of life, progress. That's out of thinking. The real progress, if you can speak in Western categories, for the Andes is to reach the ideal of good living. Buen vivir bien. Summa camania alin causai. That is, but in Western thinking, when we hear about it, when we hear, many of you should have heard about it, confuse it with a hedonistic ideal of Western consumerism of accumulating goods, and no way. It has nothing to do with it, or with the Aristotelian eubios, no, as a life in the middle of two extremes. It has to do with balance, cosmical balance. And perhaps I can say it also here, life is not a concept limited to the living beings, men, plants, animals, but life is something that concerns to all beings. The cosmos is an organism, not a machine. The second axiom of Western modernity, the diaresis between epistemic subject and object for the Andes, is not understandable. Andean philosophy does not distinguish between a rational, autonomous knowing subject and an irrational, dependent known object. You could say that the I, the identity of the I, of the ego, is secondary. First is the relation. So the main principle of Andean thinking and Andean philosophy is relationality, not some substantiality, but relationality. And personal identity or epistemic subjectivity comes after. The relations are not one of mutual exclusion or contradiction. Here I am, there is the nature. Here is the subject, there is the object. But of complementarity, reciprocity, and correspondence. These are three main principles derived from relationality. Everything can be an epistemic subject of knowledge, even a mountain, a river. Human being and nature, the rational and the emotional, the living and the inert, the intelligible and the unintelligible form a pachasophical unity characterized by polarities and parities, and not exclusions, contradictions, and dualisms. Andean epistemology is holistic and integrative. It includes aspects of ritual, collective memory, natural memory, intuition, and emotionality. You could talk about the pansuism or helisoism of Andean philosophy. Third, about the third one, this elitist anthropology in the dominant Western modern philosophy. Andean runasophy, or anthropology, as you like, holds that the human being is first and foremost a relational being, a chacana in Quechua Aymara language. Chacana means bridge, a bridge, cosmical bridge. In all senses, he or she is neither a substance nor a coincidence of two incommensurable substances, as Descartes thought, but a relational being that guarantees and makes impossible the vital flow, guarantees or makes impossible, it depends, if he really fulfills the function of being a bridge or not. So the human being is not primarily a competitor and a wolf, homo homini lupus, to others, but a complement, helper, caretaker, arariva, and facilitator. I come to the third one, no, the fourth. In contrast to modern Western anthropocentrism, Andean philosophy is cosmocentric or biocentric. In the indigenous terms, pachacentric. That means the measure of everything is not human being, but the cosmos in its relational structure that forms a kind of organism. Western philosophy has not always been anthropocentric, of course, but since Renaissance, European Renaissance, it has become more and more anthropocentric. For the Andes, the human being fulfills a function. It's not the crown of the creation, but he or she fulfills a function in the totality of the ordered cosmos, Pacha. He's a bridge, he's a caretaker. He's not a productor. The Pachamama is productive, but not human being. Fifth, it leads to the questioning of the axiom, the predominance of analytic method in description, understanding, and manipulation of the world. As I said, for this conception, the whole is the sum of its part, and that's and by knowing the parts, we know the whole. That's more or less the presupposition of dominant Western modern epistemology. For the Andean world, the whole, Pacha, is much more than the sum of its parts. So you come to a holistic, synthetic method, but is guided by the model of the organism and not of the machine. And an organism cannot be broken down into its parts without dying. So it's more a representative, symbolic understanding, which is more gynophile, more female, not in the biological sense, but in the generic sense, and more caring and not dominating. Well, I come to the last point, some remarks or some consequences for perhaps the debate on nihilism, but also the future of intercultural philosophy, perhaps. The world system still sells itself as a successful model of progress and development, while it shows its ugly face of inhumanity, authoritarianism and barbarism to the other, as we heard also concerning climate change. But the real barbarism occurs in the so-called center, in the so-called progress, and is nothing but the temporary consequence of harmful and catastrophic externalities. We put our garbage to Africa, for instance. But little by little, these externalities are knocking on the doors of the castles and bunkers of a kleptocratic elite, like boomerangs, in the form of migrants and refugees, floods and droughts, fires and pandemics. How to do intercultural philosophy in such a context? How to continue to bet on the ideal of dialogues and polylogues in symmetrical conditions? How not to be a dissident voice co-opted by the hegemony of the discourse of progress and development? Or in other words, how not to fall into the trap of being a useful fool, as Levinas warned in the prologue to Totalité et Infinie. I see three dangers, and I will close. The first is adopting an intercultural stance as a postmodern and light interculturality, and not put into the center the issue of power, asymmetries, coloniality, hegemony that has to be discussed. So we have to join intercultural philosophy with the theme of epistemic violence, of epistemicide, philosophicide. Second remark, I think academy has not really abandoned Eurocentrism or Western centrism yet, despite certain adjustments and awareness raising. Even in Latin America, the main universities are still very Eurocentric. It's not just in Europe. Eurocentrism is in the whole. I rather talk about Occidentocentrism, because it's not Eurocentrism in specific way. It's Occidentocentrism, Western centrism, as you like. So we have to establish a decolonial intercultural philosophy in order to reveal this kind of epistemic violence going on the global level. Third, I think we need to think in a form of intersectional thinking, including issues of gender, discrimination, ethnicity and skin color, sexual orientation, class, religious stance, and political dissent in our intercultural philosophy. And the last one, in Latin America, the issue of decoloniality is of particular interest and importance, but not only in Latin America. Abya has become fashionable in circles of an academic elite, but without changing the foundations of a Western centrism that is still in force. The change of terminology from a Eurocentric notion, such as Latin America, to Abya, it's just a change of words, perhaps, does not guarantee for a decolonial and inclusive mentality. The danger of allowing oneself to be co-opted by the reigning world system and naively defending an intercultural light remains. And barbarism continues to be sold as progress, development, and modernity. Thank you.